Nothing breaks the heart, quite like being forced to start over when you thought your life was settled. When you lose someone you love, the last thing you want is strangers deciding your fate for you. That's exactly what happened to Signe when her husband died in battle. The village elders said she had to marry again or lose everything. They picked Hakon, a giant warrior who seemed more beast than man. Everyone expected them to live like strangers under one roof. But at the harvest feast, with the whole village watching, Signe walked up to this scary giant of a husband. She took his rough hand in hers and did something that shocked everyone in that hall. What could a gentle widow possibly do to change a hardened warrior's heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a mother's embrace, reluctant to let go of the familiar waters that had witnessed generations of Viking lives. In the village of Skeldvik, nestled between towering cliffs and the restless sea, the rhythm of daily life had flowed unchanged for countless seasons, until the day Olaf the Bold failed to return from his raid against the Saxon settlements. Signe Eriksdotter stood before the great stone hearth in what had once been their home, her fingers tracing the silver wedding ring that still circled her finger. Above her head, Olaf's battle-axe hung in its place of honor, its blade dulled, now by months of disuse, but still radiating the memory of the man who had wielded it with such skill and fierce joy. The weapon seemed to watch over the hall like a sentinel, a reminder of the violence that had shaped their world and the gentleness that had flourished despite it. At 32, Signe possessed the kind of beauty that came not from youth alone, but from depth of character. Her auburn hair, now braided in the simple style of mourning, caught the firelight as she moved about her morning tasks. Her hands, skilled in the ancient art of weaving, bore the calluses of honest work, and her green eyes held both the warmth of summer meadows and the steel of winter storms. She had been Olaf's partner in all things, not merely his wife, but his counsel, his companion, his equal in all matters, save the swing of a sword. Their children, Astrid and Erik, had inherited the best of both parents. 12-year-old Astrid possessed her mother's keen intelligence and her father's bold spirit, though grief had made her protective of her younger brother in ways that sometimes worried Signe. The girl had taken to wearing her hair in warrior braids and practicing with wooden swords in the yard, as if she could somehow defend what remained of their family through sheer will and determination. 8-year-old Erik, meanwhile, carried his father's broad shoulders and gentle heart. Where Astrid met sorrow with defiance, Erik retreated into quiet observation, spending hours carving small figures from driftwood or helping his mother at her loom. His blue eyes, so like Olaf's, held questions he was still too young to voice, but old enough to feel in his bones. The great hall that had once echoed with Olaf's booming laughter and the voices of his warriors now felt cavernous and empty. Signe had tried to maintain the warmth and welcome that had made their home the heart of the village. But without Olaf's presence, even the most familiar routines felt hollow. The long table where they had shared so many meals stood bare, except for her weaving work, and the sleeping alcoves where guests had once rested now gathered dust and shadows. 3 months had passed since the funeral pyre had carried Olaf's spirit to Valhalla, and in that time, Signe had felt the weight of the village's expectations settling around her like chains. The laws of their people were clear and unforgiving. A widow of standing could not remain alone, not when she possessed lands and children that needed a strong hand to protect them. The old ways demanded that she take another husband, someone chosen by the elders for his ability to defend what Olaf had built rather than for any consideration of her own wishes or feelings. The village of Skeldvik itself seemed to reflect the uncertainty of these changing times. Built where the fjord opened to the sea, it commanded both the fishing grounds that fed the people and the harbors that welcomed trade ships from distant lands. The longhouses clustered around the great hall like chicks around a hen, their turf roofs green with summer grass and their walls weathered by countless storms. Beyond the village proper, fields of barley and oats stretched toward the mountains, while sheep and cattle grazed in meadows that Olaf had won through conquest and held through strength. Elder Thorvald Greybeard, the most senior of the village council, had made the elders' position clear during their meeting the previous week. A man of 60 winters with a voice like grinding stone, he had spoken with the authority of ancient law and the impatience of someone who brooked no argument. "The matter is decided, Signe Eriksdottir," he had said, his weathered hands clasped before him as he stood in the very hall where she now stood alone. 3 months of mourning is sufficient. The Saxon raids grow bolder each season, and this village needs a war leader who can swing more than memories and tears. Signe had listened in silence as the other elders nodded their agreement, men who had once deferred to her judgment when she stood beside Olaf, but who now saw her only as a problem to be solved. They spoke of her children's future, of the lands that needed defending, of the practical necessities that governed their harsh world. None spoke of her grief, still raw as an open wound, or of the love she had shared with Olaf that made the thought of another man's touch feel like betrayal. "We have chosen Hakon Bareborn," Thorvald had continued, and at the mention of that name, Signe's blood had run cold. "He is a proven warrior, a man who has faced death in a dozen battles and emerged victorious. His reputation alone will make raiders think twice before testing our defenses." Hakon Bareborn. Even children knew that name and the stories that came with it. They said he stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a mountain and hands that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. His beard was streaked with premature grey from the horrors he had witnessed, and his body bore scars from edge and flame that told the story of a life spent in violence. He had earned his by-name by killing a great brown bear with nothing but a seax knife, wrestling the beast to the ground and driving the blade into its heart, even as its claws opened his chest to the bone. But it was not his size or his scars that made men fear Hakon Bareborn. It was the emptiness they saw in his pale blue eyes. The wars had taken something vital from him, leaving behind a man who fought with terrible efficiency but no joy, who spoke little and smiled less, who seemed to carry winter in his heart even in the height of summer. He lived alone in a small longhouse at the edge of the village, taking no interest in community gatherings or the company of women, earning his keep through his skill with weapons and his willingness to face dangers that other men avoided. The elders saw in him exactly what they needed: a weapon in human form, a guardian who would defend their interests without troubling them with inconvenient emotions or demands for partnership. That he might make a poor husband or stepfather seemed not to concern them at all. They spoke of marriage as if it were merely another trade agreement, a transaction that would secure the future without regard for the human cost. Signe had wanted to protest, to remind them that she had been Olaf's partner in ruling, that her counsel had guided many of their most successful ventures, that her own mind was as sharp as any blade in their defense. But the words had died in her throat as she saw the dismissal in their eyes, the polite but firm certainty that her time of influence had ended with her husband's death. Now, as she went about her morning tasks, she could feel the weight of that decision pressing down upon her like a physical burden. In less than a fortnight, when the harvest feast marked the end of summer, she would stand before the assembled village and speak vows that would bind her to a stranger. The thought made her hands tremble as she worked at her loom. The rhythm of her weaving, the only constant in a world that seemed determined to strip away everything familiar and dear. The knock at her door came as no surprise. She had been expecting visitors all week as news of the betrothal spread through the village. What did surprise her was finding young Bjorn Ironsmith on her threshold, his usually cheerful face creased with worry and his strong hands twisted in his leather apron. "Forgive the intrusion," Lady Signe, he said, using the formal address that reminded her of everything she was about to lose. But I had to speak with you before things change. Signe stepped aside to let him enter, noting how his eyes immediately went to Olaf's axe as if seeking guidance from the dead. Bjorn had been one of Olaf's most trusted warriors, a young man whose skill at the forge was matched only by his loyalty to their family. His feelings for her had never been spoken aloud, but she had seen them in the way his gaze lingered when he thought no one was watching, in the extra care he took with weapons intended for her husband's use. "Speak freely, Bjorn," she said, gesturing toward the bench beside the fire. "These may be among the last days when I can receive visitors as I choose." The young smith's jaw tightened at her words, and for a moment she glimpsed the fury that simmered beneath his careful courtesy. "That's exactly what I've come to discuss," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This marriage, it's wrong, and everyone knows it. You deserve better than to be handed over like a prize cow to the highest bidder." Signe felt a flutter of warmth at his words, even as she recognized the danger they represented. "The elders have made their decision," she said carefully. "It's not our place to question their wisdom." "Their wisdom?" Bjorn's voice cracked like a whip. "What wisdom is there in yoking a gentle soul to a man who's forgotten how to feel? Hakon Bareborn is a killer, Lady Signe. Nothing more. He'll no more know how to cherish you than a wolf knows how to tend sheep." The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow, confirming fears she had tried to push aside. But even as part of her longed to agree, to accept the comfort he offered, she knew that such a path led only to greater sorrow. "And what would you have me do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Flee in the night like a thrall escaping bondage? Take my children and run to where? What lord would shelter a woman who defies the laws of her own people?" Bjorn leaned forward, his eyes bright with desperate hope. "Marry me instead," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I may not have Hakon's reputation with a blade, but I can protect you. I can love you as you deserve to be loved. Your children would want for nothing, and you could be happy again." For a heartbeat, Signe allowed herself to imagine it. Bjorn was a good man, kind and strong and devoted to her family. A life with him would be comfortable, familiar, built on affection, if not the deep passion she had shared with Olaf. Her children loved him already, and he would treat them as his own, without question or reservation. But even as the fantasy took shape in her mind, she saw its futility. The elders had not chosen Hakon for his wealth or his charm. They had chosen him for his ability to project strength to their enemies. In their harsh world, the appearance of weakness could invite attack, and a village defended by a blacksmith, however skilled, would be seen as ripe for conquest. "Oh, Bjorn," she said, reaching out to touch his calloused hand. "If the choice were mine alone to make, but it isn't. The elders see threats where I see friends, and they believe only a warrior like Hakon can keep those threats at bay. If I were to defy them, they would simply choose another husband for me. Perhaps one far worse than either Hakon or yourself." The young man's shoulders sagged as the truth of her words sank in, and she saw her own resignation reflected in his eyes. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of the village going about its daily business, both of them aware that they were mourning not just what had been lost, but what could never be. "I should go," Bjorn said finally, rising from the bench with the reluctance of a man leaving a warm hearth for a winter storm. "But know this, Lady Signe, if you ever have need of a friend, if things become difficult, you have only to send word. Some loyalties run deeper than laws." After he left, Signe found herself staring once again at Olaf's axe, its familiar weight a comfort even in its silence. Her husband had been a man who understood duty, who had made hard choices for the good of their people, even when those choices came at personal cost. She could almost hear his voice in the crackling of the fire, reminding her that strength sometimes meant accepting what could not be changed, and finding ways to shape what could. The harvest feast was only days away, and with it would come the moment when her old life ended and her new one began. But as she sat in the hall that had been her home for 12 years, surrounded by memories of love and laughter, Signe began to form the first tentative threads of a plan. If she could not choose her fate, perhaps she could at least choose how she would meet it, and in that choice she might find a way to surprise everyone, including herself. The day of the harvest feast dawned grey and cold, with clouds gathering over the fjord like an omen of the changes to come. Signe woke before sunrise in the sleeping alcove she had shared with Olaf, her hand reaching instinctively for the warm presence that would never again lie beside her. The empty space felt vast as an ocean, and for a moment she allowed herself to grieve anew for all that had been lost. Her marriage chest sat open beside the bed, revealing the treasures she had accumulated over years of careful planning and hopeful dreams. The wedding dress lay folded within, not the simple brown wool she had worn for her first marriage, but a masterwork of her own, weaving in deep blue that matched the fjord waters. Silver brooches caught the dim light, and ribbons of red and gold waited to adorn her hair. These things had been meant for festivals and celebrations, not for a ceremony that felt more like a funeral for her old life. Astrid appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her finest kirtle, her young face set in lines too mature for her 12 years. "Mother," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "the women have come to help you prepare." Through the open door, Signe could see the village women gathering in the main hall, Ingrid the Wise, with her weathered hands and knowing eyes, young Thora, whose own wedding had been celebrated just the previous spring, and others who had come to fulfill the ancient duties of friendship and tradition. Their presence should have been a comfort, but Signe felt only the weight of their expectations and the knowledge that after today, everything would be different. "Tell them I will be with them shortly," Signe said, though she made no move to rise from the bed. "How is Eric this morning?" Astrid's composure cracked slightly. "He's helping Bjorn at the forge. He doesn't want to watch you marry another man." The girl's words carried an accusation that cut deeper than any blade, and Signe felt the familiar guilt twist in her stomach like a living thing. "Astrid, I know you have no choice," her daughter said quickly. "I'm not a child anymore, Mother. I understand what the elders require and why they require it. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less." The honesty in those young eyes was almost more than Signe could bear. She rose and gathered her daughter into her arms, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how much she had grown in these months of mourning. Soon, Astrid would be a woman herself, facing her own choices and compromises. The thought made Signe more determined than ever to show her daughter that even when life forced unwanted changes upon you, you could still choose how to face them with dignity and grace. The preparation ritual unfolded with ancient solemnity, each step a bridge between Signe's past and future. The women braided her hair with the silver threads that marked her status, wound her arms with the gold armbands that had been her mother's, and fastened the brooches that would identify her as a wife of standing. Through it all, they spoke in soft voices about the feast to come, the quality of the harvest, anything but the significance of what was happening. Ingrid the Wise, who had delivered both of Signe's children and had known her since she was Astrid's age, worked with particular care on the final details. Her gnarled fingers smoothed the fabric of the wedding dress and adjusted the fall of the ceremonial cloak with the expertise of someone who had prepared dozens of brides over the years. "You look as beautiful as you did on your first wedding day," the old woman said, her voice carefully neutral. "Different, perhaps. There's wisdom in your face now that wasn't there before, but beautiful still." Signe studied her reflection in the polished bronze mirror, seeing a stranger wearing her face. The woman who looked back at her seemed older, more distant, as if the marriage preparations had already begun to transform her into someone else. The silver at her temples, earned through months of grief and worry, caught the light like frost, and her green eyes held depths that had not been there in her youth. "Do I look like a bride or like a sacrifice?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Ingrid's hand stilled for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. Sometimes, child, the two are not so different. But remember this: a sacrifice offered willingly has power that one taken by force can never possess. How you choose to enter this marriage will shape everything that comes after. Before Signe could ask what she meant, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, she could see a group of men approaching the hall, and at their center walked a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. Hakon Bareborn stood a full head taller than his companions, his massive frame draped in a cloak of black bearskin that made him look more like a force of nature than a man. Even at a distance, she could see the network of scars that marked his arms and the careful way he moved. Like a predator always ready for violence, he's come to claim his bride, Thora whispered, her young voice bright with excitement that felt obscene in the circumstances. They say he's never looked finer. Signe forced herself to look more closely at the man who would share her bed and her life from this day forward. Hakon had made an effort for the occasion. His dark hair was freshly braided, his beard trimmed, and he wore what appeared to be his finest clothing. But nothing could disguise the essential wildness about him, the sense that civilization sat upon him like an ill-fitting garment that he might cast aside at any moment. As if feeling her gaze, he looked up toward the window where she stood. Their eyes met across the distance, and Signe felt a jolt of something she could not name. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. For just an instant, she glimpsed something in his pale blue eyes that was not empty brutality, but rather a kind of weary resignation that matched her own. Here was another person being driven by forces beyond their control, another soul who understood the burden of unwanted duty. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, and Hakon disappeared into the great hall with his companions. But the brief connection lingered in Signe's mind like the after-image of lightning, suggesting depths beneath the surface that no one had bothered to explore. "It's time," Ingrid said gently, and Signe knew that her period of preparation had ended. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as the woman others expected her to be, but as the person she chose to become. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, its walls hung with the finest tapestries and its tables laden with the bounty of the harvest. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread, mead and ale flowing freely as the village celebrated the end of another successful growing season. But beneath the festivity, Signe could feel the undercurrent of anticipation as everyone waited for the moment when the evening's true business would begin. Hakon sat at the high table beside the empty chair that had been Olaf's, his massive presence making the familiar furniture seem small and fragile. He had spoken little since his arrival, responding to greetings with nods and grunts, his attention focused on the horn of mead before him. Up close, the scars were even more pronounced, a raised line along his jaw where a blade had come too close, marks on his hands that spoke of countless battles, and something in his eyes that suggested wounds that went deeper than flesh. Elder Thorvald stood to address the assembled crowd, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "People of Skeldvik," he began, "we gather tonight not only to celebrate the harvest that will sustain us through the winter, but to witness the joining of two lives in marriage. As our laws require and wisdom demands, Signe Eriksdottir will take a new husband to protect her children and her lands." The formal words washed over Signe like cold water, each phrase a reminder of how little choice she had in her own fate. She stood when called upon, moving through the ancient rituals with the grace her mother had taught her, speaking the vows that would bind her future to a stranger's will. Through it all, she felt as if she were watching someone else's life unfold, a player in a drama whose ending had been written long before she took the stage. But when the moment came for her to approach her new husband, something stirred within her, a spark of defiance, perhaps, or simply the refusal to surrender her dignity along with her freedom. Instead of the submissive approach that tradition demanded, Signe walked across the hall, with her head high and her eyes fixed on Hakon's face. She had chosen her fate in one crucial respect. She would not cringe before it. When she reached him, she extended her hand, not in supplication, but as an equal offering partnership. For a heartbeat, confusion flickered across Hakon's scarred features, as if no one had ever approached him with anything but fear or calculation. Then slowly, his massive hand enveloped hers, and she felt the calluses earned through years of sword work and the tremor of someone as uncertain as herself. "Dance with me," she said, the words clear enough to carry throughout the suddenly silent hall. It was not a request, but an invitation, offered freely rather than demanded by custom. And as Hakon rose to his feet, towering over her like a mountain over a meadow, Signe prepared to take the first step of a dance that would reshape both their destinies. The silence in the great hall stretched like a held breath as every eye watched the unlikely pair, the gentle widow and the fearsome warrior standing hand in hand at the center of their world. Signe could feel the weight of 100 expectations pressing down upon her, but for the first time in months, she felt truly present in her own life, rather than merely enduring it. Hakon's hand trembled almost imperceptibly in hers, and she realized with sudden clarity that this giant of a man was as uncertain as she was. The recognition sparked something warm in her chest, not attraction, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. They were both prisoners of circumstance, both struggling to find dignity within the roles that had been forced upon them. The musicians, after a moment of stunned hesitation, began to play the traditional wedding dance, a slow, stately melody that had celebrated countless unions over the generations. But as Signe began to move to the ancient rhythm, she made another choice that would be talked about for years to come. Instead of the formal, distant steps that befitted a marriage of convenience, she moved closer to her new husband, her body language speaking of partnership rather than mere obligation. Hakon's steps were awkward at first, his massive frame clearly more comfortable with the chaos of battle than the structured movements of the dance floor. But there was an unexpected gentleness in the way he held her, his calloused hands careful not to grip too tightly, his movements constrained as if he feared his own strength. Signe found herself remembering stories she had heard of wounded animals, how they became dangerous not from malice but from fear of further pain. "You dance better than the stories." "Suggest," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. A ghost of what might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "The stories say many things," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Most of them are lies." As they moved together through the ancient steps, Signe became aware of subtle details that contradicted his fearsome reputation. His clothes, while well-made, were mended in several places with stitches so neat they could only have been done by his own hand. A small wooden carving hung from his belt, a raven in flight, its details so fine they spoke of patient hours spent in careful work. These were not the possessions of a mindless brute, but of a man who valued craft and took pride in his belongings. The dance continued, and gradually other couples joined them on the floor, first the young married pairs, then the older folk, until the hall filled with swirling fabric and laughing voices. But at the center, Signe and Hakon moved in their own quiet space, learning the rhythm of each other's steps and beginning the delicate process of becoming partners. When the music finally ended, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause, raising their horns of mead in toasts to the new union. Elder Thorvald proclaimed the marriage blessed by the gods and beneficial to the village, his words carrying the weight of religious authority and political necessity. But Signe found herself looking past the ceremony to the man beside her, wondering what thoughts moved behind those pale blue eyes. The feast that followed was a blur of well-wishes and ceremonial gifts, the traditional offerings that would help establish their new household. Young couples brought lengths of rope and iron nails, practical gifts for a life built together. Older women offered wisdom in the form of herbal remedies and cooking advice, their words carrying the accumulated knowledge of generations. The men presented weapons and tools, acknowledging Hakon's role as protector and provider. Through it all, Hakon spoke little, accepting congratulations with nods and brief words of thanks. But Signe noticed how his attention kept returning to her children, who sat at the family table looking lost and uncertain. Astrid maintained her brave front, but her eyes kept drifting toward the door as if planning escape routes. Eric had barely touched his food, his small hands clenched in his lap as he struggled with emotions too complex for his young mind to process. "They're frightened," Signe said softly, when a lull in the festivities allowed for private conversation. Hakon followed her gaze to the children, and she saw something shift in his expression, a softening that transformed his harsh features into something almost gentle. "They should be," he said simply. "Their world has changed, and they don't know what to expect from me." The honesty of his response surprised her. She had expected denial or perhaps awkward reassurance, not this clear-eyed acknowledgement of the situation's difficulty. "What should they expect?" she asked. For a long moment Hakon was quiet, his scarred hands turning his drinking horn in slow circles on the table. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Safety," he said finally. "Whatever else I may be or fail to be, I will keep them safe. And I will not try to replace their father's memory with my own presence." The promise hit her unexpectedly deep, touching fears she had not even fully acknowledged. So many men would have demanded immediate acceptance, would have seen the children as obstacles to be overcome, or rivals for their mother's attention. That Hakon understood the delicacy of the situation spoke to an emotional intelligence that his reputation had never suggested. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with surprising intensity. As the evening wore on and the mead flowed more freely, the formal restraints of the ceremony began to loosen. The older men launched into the familiar tales of past glories, their voices growing louder with each retelling. The women gathered in clusters to discuss the latest news from neighboring villages, their conversation a comfortable buzz of shared concerns and gentle gossip. The younger folk organized games of skill and chance, their laughter bright against the backdrop of more serious adult business. But for all the celebration around them, Signe found herself increasingly aware of the moment approaching when she and Hakon would be expected to retire to their marriage bed. The thought filled her with a complex mixture of anxiety and curiosity. She had been a wife before, had known the intimate pleasures of married life with a man she loved. But this would be different, a joining of strangers bound by law rather than affection, a union that would need to be built from nothing into something resembling partnership. Hakon seemed equally aware of the approaching transition, his conversation growing even more sparse as the night progressed. But when their eyes met across the table, she saw not the predatory hunger she had feared, but something much more complicated. Uncertainty mixed with respect, desire tempered by restraint. Whatever happened between them, she realized, would happen at a pace they both could accept. The traditional bed-making ceremony began as the night reached its peak, with the married women of the village preparing the chamber that had once belonged to Signe and Olaf alone. They sang the ancient songs of fertility and blessing, their voices weaving promises of happiness and prosperity into the very fabric of the marriage bed. But beneath the ritual words, Signe heard the echo of her own uncertainties, the questions that would only be answered in the quiet hours to come. When the moment came to retire, Hakon offered her his arm with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout the evening. Together, they walked through the hall where their new life had begun, leaving behind the celebration and stepping into the unknown territory of their shared future. The marriage chamber felt both familiar and strange as Signe crossed the threshold with her new husband. The room that had been her sanctuary with Olaf now belonged to a man she barely knew, and every familiar object seemed to watch them with silent judgment. The great bed, built by Olaf's own hands from a living oak tree, dominated the space with its carved headboard depicting scenes of the hunt and harvest. Tonight, it would witness the beginning of something entirely new. Hakon paused, just inside the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance as he surveyed the room with the careful attention of a warrior assessing unfamiliar territory. His eyes lingered on the personal touches that made the space uniquely hers. The loom in the corner where she worked on her finest pieces, the carved chest that held her most precious belongings, the small altar where she made offerings to Frigg for the protection of her family. "This was your place with him," he said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. Signe nodded, grateful that he acknowledged the weight of what they were entering. "For 12 years, she confirmed. Every joy and sorrow of our marriage was shared within these walls." Instead of the jealousy or possessiveness she might have expected, Hakon's expression showed only thoughtful consideration. He moved slowly around the room, his calloused fingers trailing over surfaces with unexpected reverence, as if he were learning the geography of her past happiness. "Tell me about him," he said, settling onto the bench beside the window. The request surprised her. Most men would have wanted to banish any mention of a predecessor, to claim their territory without acknowledging previous ownership. Signe found herself speaking of Olaf with a freedom she had not expected, describing not the perfect hero of public memory, but the real man she had loved, with his terrible jokes and his habit of stealing honey cakes when he thought no one was looking. She spoke of his gentleness with the children, his fierce protection of those weaker than himself, and his ability to make her laugh even in the darkest moments. Hakon listened without interruption, his attention complete and respectful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "He was lucky to be loved so well," he said simply, "and wise to love you in return." The words broke something loose in Signe's chest, a knot of grief and gratitude that she had carried for months without release. For the first time since Olaf's death, someone had acknowledged not just her loss, but the preciousness of what she had lost. Tears came then, not the bitter weeping of despair, but the cleaner sorrow of someone finally understood. Hakon made no move to comfort her physically, respecting the boundaries of their new and fragile connection. But his presence was steady as a mountain, offering shelter without demanding anything in return. When the tears finally stopped, Signe felt lighter than she had in months, as if sharing the weight of memory had somehow made it easier to bear. "I don't know how to be a wife to you," she admitted when she could speak again. "Everything I know about marriage I learned with him, and I know nothing of being a husband at all," Hakon replied. "Perhaps we can learn together, without trying to copy what came before." The leather pouch at his belt held the artifact that would define this night, a pair of silver arm rings. Clearly old and beautifully crafted, their surfaces worn smooth by countless years of wear. When he drew them out, Signe could see the intricate knotwork that decorated their surface. Patterns that spoke of master craftsmanship and deep significance. "These belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice carrying a tenderness she had not heard before. "She gave them to my mother, who wore them for 30 years of marriage to my father. They're the only things of value I've kept from my family's hall." The rings told a story of love and continuity, of marriages that had endured through joy and hardship alike. That Hakon had preserved them through all his wandering years spoke to a capacity for sentiment that his reputation never suggested. When he offered them to her, it felt less like a wedding gift than a sharing of hope, a belief that their union might grow into something worthy of such treasures. "They're beautiful," she said, allowing him to slip them onto her arms. The metal was warm from his touch, and she found the weight of them oddly comforting, like an anchor in the storm of change that had swept through her life. "My grandmother said they held the blessing of 3 generations of happy wives," Hakon said, with what might have been embarrassment. "Perhaps that's only an old woman's fancy, but perhaps not," Signe finished for him. "I've learned that old women's fancies often carry more truth than young men's certainties." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, the sounds of celebration fading to a distant murmur beyond their walls. The marriage bed loomed between them, its significance unavoidable, but no longer quite so threatening. Whatever happened tonight, it would happen between two people who were beginning to understand each other, rather than between strangers performing an obligation. When Hakon finally spoke again, his words carried the weight of decision carefully made. "I won't claim what isn't freely given," he said. "Whatever we become to each other, it will grow in its own time and its own way." The relief that flooded through Signe was so intense it was almost physical, releasing tensions she had carried since the day the elders announced their decision. Here was a man who understood that intimacy could not be commanded, only invited, that he would give her time to grieve, to heal, to choose their future rather than simply endure it, meant more than any gift of gold or silver. "Thank you," she whispered, and saw in his eyes that he understood the full measure of what she meant. They prepared for sleep with the awkward courtesy of strangers sharing space, each careful not to intrude upon the other's privacy. But when they finally lay side by side in the great bed, there was peace between them rather than tension. The silver arm rings caught the last light of the dying fire, their ancient patterns seeming to promise that time and patience could work wonders that force never could. Outside their window, the village of Skeldvik settled into the quiet rhythms of night, its people secure in their homes and satisfied with the day's work done. But in the marriage chamber, two lonely souls had taken the first tentative steps toward something that might, with care and time, grow into the kind of love that legends celebrated and arm rings blessed. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded like the careful weaving of a new tapestry, each day adding another thread to the pattern of their shared life. Signe found herself studying this strange man who now shared her home, watching for signs of the violence that everyone claimed lived within him. But what she discovered instead was a soul as wounded as her own. Carefully hidden beneath layers of protective silence, Hakon rose before dawn each morning, moving through the house with surprising quietness for such a large man. She would wake to find him already gone, returning later with fresh game or fish from the fjord, providing for the household with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. He spoke little during these early days, but his actions spoke volumes about his character, the way he checked the door latches each night, the careful attention he paid to the children's needs, the respect he showed for the rhythms of the home she had built with Olaf. The children, meanwhile, navigated their new reality with the resilience of youth, tempered by understandable wariness. Astrid maintained her protective stance toward Eric, but Signe noticed her daughter watching Hakon with growing curiosity rather than fear. The girl had inherited her father's tactical mind, and she was clearly assessing whether this giant of a man posed a threat to their family or might actually prove to be the protector the elders claimed he would be. Eric's response was more complex, alternating between shy fascination and sudden retreats into himself when memories of his father overwhelmed him. But Hakon seemed to understand the boy's struggle instinctively, never pushing for acceptance or trying to force a relationship that would need time to grow naturally. The artifact that came to define these early weeks was Hakon's battle-worn seax knife, which he cleaned and sharpened each evening by the fire. It was not the massive blade of legend, but a working tool, its leather-wrapped handle shaped by years of use, its steel nicked and scarred from countless tasks, both martial and mundane. Watching him tend to it with such care, Signe began to understand that this weapon was more than mere iron. It was a connection to his past, a reminder of who he had been and what he had survived. One evening, as the autumn wind howled around their hall and the fire burned low in the hearth, young Eric approached the bench where Hakon sat working on his blade. The boy had been carving a piece of driftwood, a habit he had inherited from his father, but his small knife had grown dull with use. "Could you—" Eric began, then stopped, his courage failing him at the crucial moment. Hakon looked up from his own blade, taking in the boy's frustrated expression and the dull knife in his small hands. Without a word, he set aside his seax and held out his hand for Eric's tool. The boy handed it over with the careful reverence children reserved for important moments, and Hakon began to work the stone along its edge with the same attention he gave to his own weapon. "A blade is only as good as the hand that tends it," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of a man sharing hard-won wisdom. "And a dull knife is more dangerous than a sharp one. It requires more force, gives you less control." Eric watched intently as the steel took on a new keenness under Hakon's skilled touch. "My father taught me to carve," the boy said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they had been held back too long. "He said the wood would tell me what it wanted to become if I listened carefully enough." "Your father was a wise man," Hakon replied, testing the knife's edge with his thumb before handing it back. "What is this piece telling you?" The boy studied his carving with new seriousness, turning it in the firelight to examine its emerging form. I think it wants to be a ship," he said. "A longship, like the ones the traders bring to our harbor." "Then you should listen to it," Hakon said simply. "Wood knows its own nature better than we do." From that night forward, Eric began to seek Hakon's company more often, bringing his carving to work beside the hearth while the big man tended his weapons or repaired gear. They rarely spoke during these sessions, but a comfortable silence grew between them, the kind of companionship that needed no words to flourish. Astrid proved more challenging, her defensive instincts stronger and her memories of her father more vivid and protective. She tested Hakon in small ways, leaving her practice sword where he might trip over it, asking pointed questions about his past battles, watching his reactions to determine what kind of man he truly was beneath his fearsome reputation. Hakon passed these tests not by proving his strength, but by showing his restraint. When she left obstacles in his path, he simply moved them aside without comment. When she challenged him with questions designed to provoke anger, he answered with quiet honesty about the realities of war and the weight of the choices he had made. Slowly, grudgingly, Astrid began to accept that perhaps the elders had chosen better than she had expected. For Signe, watching these careful negotiations unfold was both heartening and heartbreaking. She could see her children beginning to accept Hakon's presence in their lives, but she also felt the weight of Olaf's absence more keenly than ever. Her late husband had been so natural with the children, so effortless in his love and guidance. Hakon's careful, deliberate approach to fatherhood was admirable, but it highlighted everything they had lost. The village, meanwhile, watched their new family dynamic with the fascination that small communities reserved for their own drama. Some had expected explosive conflicts between the gentle widow and the warrior, while others had predicted cold indifference that would make their marriage a mere business arrangement. Instead, they witnessed something more subtle and perhaps more profound: the slow, careful construction of genuine partnership between two people who had never expected to find such a thing. Bjorn Ironsmith remained a complication, his feelings for Signe unchanged by her marriage to another. He found excuses to visit their hall more often than necessary, bringing tools that needed no repair or offering help with tasks that Hakon was perfectly capable of handling himself. The young smith's jealousy was carefully controlled, but impossible to miss, adding an undercurrent of tension to the household's gradually improving harmony. Hakon, for his part, seemed aware of Bjorn's feelings, but chose to address them through action rather than confrontation. He made sure to be present when the smith visited, not from possessiveness, but from a desire to make clear that he took his role as protector seriously. The two men circled each other with the wariness of wolves establishing territory, neither willing to provoke open conflict, but both determined to make their positions understood. As the weeks turned toward the heart of autumn, Signe found herself drawn into conversations with Hakon that revealed depths she had never suspected beneath his scarred exterior. These talks came in stolen moments, while they worked side by side preparing for winter. During the quiet hours after the children had gone to sleep, in the comfortable silences that had replaced the awkward tension of their early days together. It was during one such evening, as they sat before the fire mending winter clothing, that Hakon began to speak of his past with an openness that surprised them both. The artifact that prompted this sharing was an old leather-bound journal, worn smooth by handling and marked with careful notches along its spine. He had been writing in it when Signe entered the hall, but had quickly closed it and set it aside with the embarrassment of someone caught in an intimate act. "You keep a record," she observed, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Hakon's massive hands stilled on the tunic he was patching, and for a moment she thought he would retreat into his usual silence. But something in her tone, perhaps the lack of judgment, or simply the natural intimacy that had grown between them, loosened his tongue. "My grandfather taught me letters when I was young," he said slowly. "Said a man who couldn't record his thoughts was a slave to his own forgetfulness. I've kept the habit, though there's little poetry in what I write. What do you record?" she asked gently, setting aside her own work to give him her full attention. The journal itself told part of the story, its pages filled with observations about weather patterns, notes on the behavior of animals, sketches of unfamiliar plants encountered during his travels. But between these practical entries, she glimpsed something more personal, reflections on loneliness, questions about purpose, and most recently, careful observations about the children's progress and her own habits and preferences. "The things I need to remember," he said simply. "The mistakes I've made, the lessons I've learned, the faces of the people I've—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening as if he had said more than he intended. "The people you've killed," Signe finished quietly, and saw him flinch as if struck. For a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the crackling of the fire and the wind outside their walls. When Hakon finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confessions long held in silence. 43, he said. "Men mostly, but some women who fought beside them. I remember every face, every name when I knew it. The journal keeps them present, reminds me what violence costs, even when it's necessary." The revelation hit Signe like a physical blow, not because of the number, she had known he was a warrior, but because of the pain it clearly caused him to carry such memories. This was not the empty brutality the story suggested, but something far more complex and troubling. A man who killed efficiently but never easily, who bore the weight of his actions like stones in his soul. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Hakon was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his words came slowly, as if he were discovering his own thoughts in the act of speaking them. "I regret the necessity," he said finally. "I regret living in a world where such choices must be made. But the acts themselves, no. Each death I carry was earned through the violence of the one who died. I've never killed for pleasure or profit, only to protect those who couldn't protect themselves." The distinction mattered, Signe realized, though she couldn't fully articulate why. There was a difference between a man who enjoyed violence and one who simply excelled at it when forced to act. Hakon clearly fell into the latter category, and the burden he carried because of it spoke to a conscience that his reputation never acknowledged. "Is that why you live alone?" she asked. "Because of what people see when they look at you?" "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I feared what I might become if I stayed too long in one place, grew too comfortable with ordinary life. War has a way of marking a man, making it hard to remember what peace feels like." The conversation was interrupted by young Astrid's appearance in the doorway, her hair mussed with sleep and her eyes wide with the remnants of some troubling dream. She looked between her mother and stepfather with the uncertainty of a child who had heard voices but not words, unsure whether she was intruding on something important. "Bad dream?" Signe asked gently, opening her arms in invitation. Astrid crossed the room to nestle against her mother's side, but her eyes remained fixed on Hakon with an intensity that suggested she was wrestling with questions of her own. "I dreamed about father," she said quietly. "He was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand the words." Hakon closed his journal and set it aside, giving the girl his full attention. "Dreams of the dead often carry messages," he said seriously, treating her words with the respect due to any adult's concerns. But sometimes the message isn't in the words, it's in the feeling they leave behind. What do you mean? Astrid asked, her wariness of him temporarily forgotten in her need to understand. Your father loved you very much, Hakon said simply. Perhaps what he was trying to tell you is that love doesn't end just because the one who gave it is no longer here. Perhaps he wanted you to know that it's safe to accept new protectors without betraying his memory. The girl considered this with the serious attention she gave to all important matters, her young mind working through implications that adults might struggle to articulate. Do you think he would approve of you? She asked with a directness that only children could manage. Hakon was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. I think he would want someone who would keep you safe and honor your mother, he said finally. Whether I'm worthy of that trust, that's something you'll have to decide for yourself. It was exactly the right answer, Signe realized. Not a demand for acceptance or a claim of worthiness, but an acknowledgement that trust must be earned rather than commanded. Astrid seemed to understand this too, and something in her posture relaxed, as if a burden she had been carrying had suddenly grown lighter. The moment was broken by the arrival of messengers from the neighbouring village of Thornwick, their horses foam-flecked with hard riding, and their faces grim with urgent news. Saxon raiders had been spotted along the coast, moving in greater numbers than any had seen in recent memory. The time for peaceful domestic life was ending, and Hakon's true test as protector of Skeldvik was about to begin. The messenger from Thornwick collapsed on the threshold of their hall, his face pale with exhaustion and terror. Blood stained his cloak from a hastily bandaged wound on his shoulder, and his words came in gasps between desperate attempts to catch his breath. Hakon Bareborn, he managed, his eyes searching the room until they found the giant warrior. Thank the gods you're here. Everyone needs to know. The Saxons aren't just raiding anymore. They're coming to stay. Elder Thorvald arrived within moments, followed by the other village leaders who had heard the commotion. The great hall filled quickly as word spread through Skeldvik, and Signe found herself playing hostess to an impromptu war council in the space where she had so recently celebrated her marriage. The contrast was jarring, from domestic peace to the planning of violence in the span of a heartbeat, but it was what the messenger revealed next that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. As the man accepted a horn of ale and began to tell his tale properly, the true scope of the threat became clear. The Saxon force wasn't the usual collection of opportunistic raiders they had faced before. It was an organized army, led by a man whose name made even seasoned warriors pale with recognition. Elred the Bloody leads them, the messenger said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. 300 men, maybe more. They've taken Thornwick's harbour and declared it their new settlement. They mean to hold it through the winter and spread inland come spring. The name struck Signe like a physical blow, though she kept her reaction carefully controlled. Eldred the Bloody was no stranger to their family. He was the Saxon war leader who had killed her first husband in the skirmish that had started this entire chain of events. The irony was bitter as winter ale. The very threat that had forced her into marriage with Hakon was led by the man responsible for making her a widow in the first place. But that irony paled beside what the messenger revealed next, his words carrying an artifact of information that would reshape everything they thought they understood about their world. From his travel pack, he withdrew a leather scroll case, its contents bearing the seal of the Saxon king himself. They carry this wherever they go, he said, opening the case with trembling fingers, proclaiming their right to these lands by ancient treaty. They claim our entire coast was promised to them by some agreement made generations ago. Hakon took the scroll with hands that seemed steadier than Signe felt, his pale eyes scanning the Latin text with a fluency that surprised everyone present. His literacy was clearly more extensive than anyone had suspected, and his expression grew darker with each line he read. This document claims that King Olaf Redbeard, not our Olaf, But the legendary king from 3 generations past signed a treaty ceding all lands west of the Great Fjord to Saxon settlement in exchange for peace with their southern neighbors, Hakon said slowly. It bears what appears to be an authentic royal seal. The implications hit the assembled leaders like an avalanche. If the document was genuine, then everything they had fought to build, every acre they had cleared and defended, every life that had been lost in border skirmishes, had been built on land that legally belonged to their enemies. Their entire way of life was suddenly in question. Their right to exist in their ancestral homes, challenged by parchment and seal. It's a forgery, Bjorn Ironsmith declared hotly, his young face flushed with indignation. No Norse king would sell his people's birthright to Saxon dogs. But Elder Thorvald's expression was troubled, his weathered features creased with worry that went deeper than simple skepticism. King Olaf Redbeard was known for his pragmatism, he said slowly. And the southern wars were desperate times. Men have made stranger bargains when facing annihilation. The debate that followed was heated but inconclusive. Some argued for immediate attack, striking the Saxons before they could establish stronger positions. Others counseled caution, suggesting they send emissaries to verify the document's authenticity before taking action that might prove their own people to be the aggressors. Through it all, Hakon remained silent, his attention fixed on the scroll with an intensity that made Signe suspect he was seeing more in its contents than he was sharing. It was only after the others had left to spread word through the village and prepare for whatever response they would ultimately choose that Hakon revealed the true depth of the crisis they faced. Alone with Signe in the hall that had become their refuge from the world's complexities, he spoke words that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. "The document is genuine," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I've seen that particular scribe's hand before, and the seal bears markings that would be impossible to forge. More than that, I know the story it tells is true." Signe felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. "How could you possibly know that?" Hakon was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands turning the scroll case over and over as if it were a weapon he was preparing to use. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, weighted with the burden of secrets long held. "Because I was there when it was signed," he said. "Not as Hakon Bareborn, the wandering warrior you married, but as Hakon Olafsson, youngest son of King Olaf Redbeard, and rightful heir to the throne that my brothers died fighting over." The revelation struck Signe like lightning, illuminating connections she had never imagined in a flash of terrible clarity. This man she had married, this giant who carved ravens and tended weapons with gentle precision, was not just any warrior, but the lost prince of legend. The scars he bore weren't just from random battles, but from the civil war that had torn the royal family apart. His exile, his solitary life, his careful distance from power and politics, all of it suddenly made sense in ways that transformed everything she thought she knew about their situation. "You're the rightful king," she whispered, the words feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. "I was the rightful heir," Hakon corrected grimly. "But that was before I watched my brothers murder each other for a crown I never wanted. Before I saw what the pursuit of power does to men's souls. I chose exile over kingship. Signe, I chose to be a simple warrior rather than a ruler whose every decision would be written in other people's blood." The weight of this knowledge settled over the hall like a shroud, transforming their domestic peace into something far more complex and dangerous. If Hakon's identity became known, it would change everything, not just for their family, but for every soul in Skeldvik and beyond. The Saxons would no longer be dealing with a simple village, but with a claimant to the throne, whose very existence challenged their legal right to the lands they occupied. "What do we do?" Signe asked, though she already suspected the answer would reshape their lives as dramatically as his revelation had reshaped her understanding of who he was. Hakon stood and moved to the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light of day. Outside, the village prepared for war, but inside their hall, an even greater conflict was taking shape, between the man who wanted only peace and the king whose crown might be the only thing that could save his people. "We do what we must," he said finally. "But first, I need to tell you the rest of the story. Because the treaty the Saxons carry isn't just about land. It's about a promise I made to a dying father, and a burden I've carried in exile for 15 years. The revelation of Hakon's true identity hung between them like a blade suspended by spider's silk, its weight threatening to sever everything they had built together. Signe found herself studying this man she had married with new eyes, searching for signs of the prince beneath the warrior's scars, trying to reconcile the gentle stepfather who helped her children with their evening tasks, with the heir to a throne that commanded the loyalty of thousands. As if sensing her scrutiny, Hakon began to speak again, his voice carrying the cadence of someone unburdening himself of secrets too long held. The artifact that dominated this confession was his father's ring, a massive gold band set with garnets that he drew from a hidden compartment in his travel chest. The royal seal of the House of Olaf gleamed in the firelight, its intricate carving depicting the raven and the wolf locked in eternal struggle, symbols of wisdom and strength that had guided his bloodline for generations. "My father was dying when he signed that treaty," Hakon said, turning the ring over in his scarred hands. "The southern wars had bled us white, and Saxon ships were already raiding our coasts with impunity. He believed that ceding the disputed territories would buy us peace. Time to rebuild our strength." Signe listened in silence as he painted a picture of a kingdom in crisis, torn between the ambitions of neighboring powers and weakened by internal strife. King Olaf Redbeard had been a pragmatist above all else, willing to sacrifice pride for survival, territory for time. But his sons had seen the treaty as betrayal, a surrender of their birthright that dishonored everything their ancestors had bled to build. "My eldest brother Magnus called it cowardice," Hakon continued, his voice growing bitter with old pain. "He said a true king would die before yielding Norse soil to Saxon feet. My middle brother Eric saw opportunity. If Magnus was unfit to rule, perhaps a more flexible leader could renegotiate the terms to our advantage. The civil war that followed had been swift and brutal, brother against brother in a conflict that tore the kingdom apart at its very foundations. Magnus had fallen first, killed in single combat by Eric's champion, while Hakon watched from the ranks of his own supporters. But Eric's victory had been short-lived, lasting only until the night a servant's knife found his heart, wielded by agents whose loyalty lay with other claimants to the throne. "I could have pressed my own claim," Hakon said, slipping the ring onto his finger where it fit with the familiarity of long habit. "I had supporters, men who believed the youngest prince might unite what his brothers had divided. But I had seen what the crown cost, watched it corrupt good men and destroy the bonds of family. I chose exile instead. Let it be known that Hakon Olafsson had died with his brothers, leaving only Hakon Bareborn to wander the world as a masterless warrior. The weight of this history pressed down upon the hall like a physical presence, transforming their domestic sanctuary into something that felt more like a throne room, awaiting its rightful occupant. But Signe's mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what he had revealed, the connections between past and present that would reshape their immediate future. "The Saxons don't know who you are," she said, not a question but a statement of strategic understanding. "No," Hakon confirmed. "To them, I'm just another village warrior, albeit one with a certain reputation. But if they knew, if they understood that the heir who signed away their legal claims still lived, they would have to kill you to make their possession secure," Signe finished, her mind already calculating the deadly mathematics of the situation they faced. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and moments later, Elder Thorvald entered the hall with news that made their private crisis suddenly urgent and public. 3 Saxon emissaries had arrived under flag of truce, demanding to speak with the village leaders about terms of surrender. They would arrive at dawn, expecting immediate compliance with their legal claims and offering terms that were generous only by the standards of complete conquest. "They're giving us one day to consider," Thorvald said, his weathered face grim with the weight of impossible choices. "Submit to Saxon rule, accept their appointed governors, pay tribute, or face the consequences of defying a legal claim backed by 300 warriors." Hakon listened to the terms with the careful attention of someone weighing military options, but Signe could see the deeper calculation in his pale eyes. This was no longer just about defending a village. It was about confronting a past he had tried to leave behind, accepting responsibilities he had spent 15 years avoiding. After Thorvald left to spread word of the Saxon ultimatum, Hakon sat in silence for a long time, the royal ring catching firelight as he contemplated choices that would affect not just their family, but the entire future of their people. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decision that would reshape everything. "I have to tell them," he said quietly. "The village council, the elders, they need to know who I really am before they decide how to respond to the Saxon demands." Signe felt her heart clench with fear that had nothing to do with enemy warriors or political complications. "If you reveal yourself, there's no going back. You won't be able to return to the simple life we've been building together. The crown will claim you whether you want it or not." "Perhaps," Hakon admitted. "But I can't let innocent people suffer for my cowardice. If my identity can give them leverage in negotiations, or if my claim can legally challenge the Saxon position, then I have no right to remain silent." The night that followed was one of preparation and quiet farewell to the peaceful existence they had shared for such a brief time. Hakon spent hours writing in his journal, recording not battle plans or strategic considerations, but personal messages, words for Astrid about courage and duty, thoughts for Eric about the importance of choosing one's own path, and most importantly, pages dedicated to Signe herself, expressing feelings he had never quite managed to speak aloud. For her part, Signe found herself torn between pride and terror as she watched her husband prepare to step back into a role he had never wanted but was uniquely qualified to fill. This man, who had been so careful with her children's feelings, so patient with their gradual acceptance, was about to reveal himself as someone whose very existence would make them targets for every ambitious lord and enemy agent in the northern kingdoms. That the children sensed the tension without understanding its source, clustering around their parents with the instinctive fear of young animals who smell predators on the wind. Hakon gathered them close, speaking to them with gentle honesty about changes that were coming, responsibilities that could no longer be avoided, and the possibility that their family's life was about to become far more complicated than any of them had ever imagined. As dawn approached, bringing with it the Saxon emissaries and the moment of truth that would reshape their world, Signe made her own decision. Whatever came next, she would stand beside this man she had married, not just as his wife, but as his partner in whatever role fate demanded he play. The quiet widow who had been forced into marriage was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes love meant accepting not just the person you had married, but the destiny they carried with them. The artifact that would define the coming confrontation was already in place. Hakon's father's ring, worn openly for the first time in 15 years. Its royal seal catching the first light of dawn as he prepared to reclaim a crown he had never wanted, but could no longer refuse. Outside their door, the village of Skeldvik prepared for war. But inside their hall, a king prepared to be reborn from the ashes of his own exile. The Saxon emissaries would arrive within the hour, expecting to deal with simple villagers and their crude defenses. Instead, they would find themselves face to face with the rightful heir to the throne, whose treaty they carried, the man whose very existence challenged their legal claim to Norse soil. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Skeldvik, but the future of every soul who called the northern fjords home. The Saxon emissaries arrived with the pomp and confidence of men who believed their victory was already assured. 3 riders in fine mail, their horses decorated with the blue and gold banners of their king, they approached the great hall of Skeldvik as if they were already its masters. At their head rode a man Signe recognized from descriptions, tall, lean, with the calculating eyes of someone who had never lost a negotiation because he had never entered one from a position of weakness. This was Wulfric the law speaker, the Saxon diplomat whose reputation for cunning matched his leader's reputation for violence. Behind him rode 2 younger men, clearly warriors despite their role as emissaries, their hands never straying far from their sword hilts even under the protection of the truce banner they carried. The village council had assembled in the great hall, their faces grim with the weight of decisions that would shape the future of everyone they had sworn to protect. Elder Thorvald sat at the head of the long table, his weathered hands folded before him in a display of calm that fooled no one who knew him well. Beside him sat the other leaders of Skeldvik, craftsmen and warriors, farmers and fishermen, all united in their determination to defend their home regardless of the cost. But it was the vigor seated to Thorvald's right that would transform this negotiation from a simple demand for surrender into something far more complex and dangerous. Hakon wore his father's ring openly now, the royal seal catching the morning light that streamed through the hall's windows. He had braided his hair in the ancient style of kings, and over his shoulders hung a cloak that bore the subtle markings of royal house, not ostentatious enough to be immediately recognized, but clear enough to those who knew what to look for. When the Saxons entered, their confidence was absolute. Wulfric carried himself with the bearing of a man delivering inevitable news, his companions flanking him like ceremonial guards. But Signe noticed the moment when the law speaker's eyes fell upon Hakon, saw the flicker of confusion that crossed his features as he tried to reconcile the giant warrior's presence with his own assumptions about who would be leading this negotiation. "I am Wulfric, servant of King Aelred and bearer of his lawful commands," the Saxon began, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced authority. "I come to offer terms of surrender to the people of Skeldvik, terms that acknowledge the legal reality of Saxon ownership of these lands while showing mercy to those who have unknowingly trespassed upon our territory." Elder Thorvald started to respond, but Hakon raised a hand in a gesture that carried such natural authority that even the Saxon law speaker paused. When the giant warrior rose to his feet, his massive frame seemed to fill the hall. And for the first time since their arrival, the emissaries looked uncertain. "You speak of legal reality," Hakon said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of power that made everyone present lean forward. "Perhaps you would be interested in hearing from someone who was present when the treaty you carry was signed." The words hit the Saxon delegation like a physical blow. Wulfric's eyes narrowed as he studied Hakon with new intensity, clearly trying to place this figure who spoke with such authority about events that had occurred decades earlier. The 2 warrior escorts shifted positions subtly, their hands moving closer to their weapons despite the sacred nature of the truce they traveled under. "Impossible," Wulfric said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "All who were present at that signing are long dead. King Olaf Redbeard died 15 years ago, and his sons perished in the civil war that followed." Hakon reached into his travel pouch and withdrew a second artifact that would reshape the entire negotiation, a parchment bearing his father's personal seal, not the royal seal that appeared on the treaty, but the private mark that King Olaf had used for correspondence with his most trusted advisors. The document was a letter written in the king's own hand, addressed to his youngest son and containing specific details about the treaty negotiations that no forger could have known. 2 of his sons died in that war, Hakon said quietly, extending the letter for Wulfric's inspection. But the 3rd chose exile over a crown stained with his brother's blood. "I am Hakon Olafsson, rightful heir to the throne of the northern kingdoms, and I am here to tell you that the treaty you carry was signed under duress by a dying king who believed he had no other choice. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the hall understood that they had just witnessed a moment that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. The legal claim that the Saxons had considered unshakable was suddenly thrown into question by the testimony of the one person whose word could not be dismissed. Wulfric examined the letter with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on its authenticity. When he looked up, his calculating eyes held a new wariness that acknowledged the dangerous complexity of what he was facing. "Even if you are who you claim," he said slowly, "the treaty stands as written. Your father's signature binds his heirs, regardless of the circumstances under which it was given. But Hakon's response would change everything. His next words carrying the weight of legal precedent and royal authority that would turn negotiation into confrontation and force both sides to choose between compromise and war. Hakon's response came with the measured authority of someone who had spent 15 years thinking about this moment, even if he had hoped it would never arrive. He drew himself to his full height, and in that instant, every person in the hall could see not just the warrior they had known, but the king he had been born to become. "The treaty my father signed was conditional," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with absolute certainty. It ceded territorial rights only so long as the Saxon forces remained south of the Great Fjord and made no aggressive moves against Norse settlements. Your leader, Elred the Bloody, violated those conditions the moment he led raids against our villages. Wulfric's face went pale as the implications sank in. If Hakon spoke truth, and the personal letter suggested he did, then the Saxon legal claim was built on a foundation that their own actions had destroyed. By raiding Norse settlements, including the attack that had killed Olaf the Bold, they had broken the very treaty they now sought to enforce. "You lie," one of the younger emissaries snarled, his hand moving to his sword hilt despite the sacred nature of their truce. "No such conditions exist in the document we carry." But Hakon was already reaching for another artifact that would seal the Saxons' fate. A second scroll case, this one bearing the intact seal of the Royal Archive. From within, he drew a document that made Wulfric's breath catch audibly. It was the original treaty, not the abbreviated version the Saxons had been carrying, but the complete text with all its conditions and contingencies clearly spelled out. "This is the full treaty," Hakon said, laying it on the table where all could see. "The version you carry is a summary meant for field commanders, omitting the legal conditions that bound both parties. Section 7 clearly states that any aggressive action by Saxon forces against established Norse settlements would void the territorial concessions immediately." The evidence was overwhelming, the legal case irrefutable. But Signe could see in Wulfric's eyes that the Saxon law speaker was calculating odds that had nothing to do with legal precedent. Behind his diplomatic facade lay the mind of a predator, realizing that law mattered little when backed by 300 warriors against a single village. "Even so," Wulfric said slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "King Elred's army holds the coast. Legal niceties mean little against steel and flame. Perhaps it would be wiser to negotiate new terms rather than cling to parchments that cannot protect your people." The threat was barely veiled, but it had miscalculated the audience it faced. These were Norse villages, people whose ancestors had carved homes from wilderness and held them against every enemy the world could send. The suggestion that they should bow to superior force simply because resistance would be costly only stiffened their resolve. Elder Thorvald rose from his seat, his weathered face set in lines of granite determination. "We have heard your king's terms," he said formally. "Now hear ours. Withdraw from our lands by the next full moon. Restore what you have taken from our neighbors, and we will consider this a misunderstanding between peoples who should be trading partners, not enemies." The Saxon emissaries exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of Norse sanity. But it was Hakon who delivered the words that would transform negotiation into inevitable conflict. Furthermore, he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of royal decree, as rightful king of the northern realms, I hereby declare the territorial concessions made in my father's treaty to be null and void due to Saxon violation of its terms. Any Saxon forces remaining on Norse soil after the deadline will be considered invaders, subject to immediate and total warfare. The declaration hit the hall like lightning, electrifying the Norse villagers with the realization that they were no longer facing this crisis alone. They had a king again, a rightful ruler whose claim could unite the scattered settlements against their common enemy. But for the Saxon emissaries, the words carried a different meaning entirely. They were looking at the man whose very existence threatened everything their expedition had been sent to accomplish. Wulfric's diplomatic mask finally slipped entirely, revealing the calculating warrior beneath. "You realize," he said quietly, "that by revealing yourself, you have signed the death warrant for everyone in this village. King Elred cannot allow a rival claimant to live, especially one whose legal position threatens our entire presence in these lands. Then Elred the Bloody will have to come and collect that warrant himself," Hakon replied with grim finality. "But know this, the man you face is no longer a village warrior defending his home. You face Hakon Olafsson, king of the northern realms, and I will not yield 1 foot of my ancestors' soil to Saxon ambition." The emissaries departed with threats rather than agreements, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to herald the storm of violence approaching on the horizon. But in the great hall of Skeldvik, something extraordinary had happened. A king had been reborn, and with him, the hope that scattered Norse settlements might unite against the Saxon threat. 3 days after the Saxon emissaries departed with their ultimatum, the first responses to Hakon's revelation began arriving in Skeldvik. Messengers rode hard through mountain passes and along fjord paths, carrying word to every Norse settlement within 100 miles that their rightful king had returned. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors began arriving before the sun had set on the second day, their loyalty to the crown transcending the years of exile and civil war that had divided the realm. Signe watched from her doorway as the village transformed into something resembling a military camp. Tents sprouting in the fields beyond the houses as contingents arrived from villages whose names she had only heard in stories. These were not the desperate farmers and fishermen she had expected, but seasoned fighters who remembered the old king's justice and had been waiting 15 years for his heir to reclaim what was rightfully his. The artifact that came to symbolize this transformation was Hakon's father's war banner, a magnificent piece of work in blue and silver silk, depicting the royal ravens in flight above the ancient crown of the northern realms. Hakon had kept it folded away in the deepest part of his travel chest, but now it flew from a pole planted in the great hall's courtyard, visible to every soul who entered Skeldvik and serving as a rallying point for the growing army. By the end of the first week, nearly 800 warriors had answered the call, their numbers growing daily as word spread through the scattered settlements. More importantly, they brought with them something the Saxons had not anticipated: detailed knowledge of every hidden path, every defensible position, every supply cache that could sustain a campaign in the harsh northern terrain. These were men fighting for their homeland, and they possessed advantages that no foreign army could match. The reunion between Hakon and his father's old war chiefs was emotional in ways that surprised everyone, including the king himself. Men who had served 3 generations of rulers knelt before the son they had thought lost forever, their weathered faces wet with tears as they renewed oaths they had first sworn as young warriors. Elder Gunnar Ironside, who had been the old king's closest advisor, wept openly as he placed his hands between Hakon's and spoke the ancient words of fealty. "We thought the royal line was broken," the old warrior said, his voice thick with emotion. We thought our oaths died with your brothers, and that we would go to our graves, having failed our king's trust. But you live, my lord, and with you the hope of our people. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor on the 10th day that truly changed the nature of their situation. A single rider approached under a flag of truce, but this was no Saxon emissary. Instead, it was a Norse woman of middle years, her travel-stained clothes marking her as someone who had ridden hard and far to reach them. When she spoke, her words carried news that would reshape the entire conflict. "I am Ingrid Eriksdotter, sister to Jarl Erik of the Western Fjords," she announced to the assembled war council. "My brother sends word that the Saxon fleet anchored at Thornwick is not as secure as they believe. Half their ships are pulled up on the beach for repairs, and their army is divided between holding the harbor and foraging for winter supplies." The intelligence was priceless, but it came with an even more valuable offer. The Western Fjords commanded the finest shipwrights and sailors in the northern realms, and they were prepared to bring their fleet into alliance with their returned king. Suddenly, the strategic situation shifted from desperate defense to the possibility of decisive victory. Hakon accepted the alliance with the gratitude it deserved, but Signe noticed how the weight of kingship was already changing him. The gentle giant who had learned to tend her children's scraped knees now spent his days planning campaigns and weighing the lives of thousands in his strategic calculations. The crown he had never wanted was claiming him piece by piece, and she felt a profound sadness for the simple life they were losing even as she took pride in the leader he was becoming. The final confrontation came not as a massive battle, but as a series of coordinated strikes that demonstrated the difference between foreign invaders and defenders fighting for their ancestral home. Using knowledge gained from years of hunting and fishing in these waters, the Norse fleet struck the Saxon ships at dawn while they lay vulnerable on the beach. Simultaneously, Hakon led the land forces in an attack on the divided Saxon army. Catching them between the hammer of direct assault and the anvil of local terrain they did not understand. Elred the Bloody fell in single combat with Hakon himself, the Saxon war leader's reputation proving no match for the skill and righteous fury of a king defending his people. With their leader dead and their fleet in flames, the surviving Saxons surrendered rather than face annihilation in hostile territory they could never hope to hold. The aftermath brought changes that rippled through every aspect of life in the northern realms. Hakon was formally crowned in the ancient ceremony at the sacred grove, accepting the crown he had fled from 15 years earlier, but now understood to be his inescapable destiny. The scattered settlements united under his rule, their strength multiplied by cooperation rather than diminished by division. For Signe, the transformation from village widow to queen consort was dizzying in its scope and complexity. But as she stood beside her husband during his coronation, wearing the ancient crown of Norse queens and feeling the weight of a nation's hopes upon her shoulders, she realized that some changes, however unexpected, could lead to purposes greater than any individual dream. Their children adapted to royal life with the resilience of youth. Though Astrid never quite lost her protective instincts, and Erik continued to carve small figures by the fire, now in halls that echoed with the business of governing a kingdom. The family they had built in those brief months of peaceful marriage became the foundation for a dynasty that would rule with wisdom earned through suffering and strength forged in the crucible of unexpected love, and in the royal archives, carefully preserved among the most precious documents of the realm, sat a simple leather journal, the record of a warrior's thoughts and a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest kings are those who never sought the crown but accepted it when their people's need called them home.